lust is not inevitable. That lust isn't something that is guaranteed. And so if I start with the belief that I will always lust, well, more than likely then I will always lust. So one of the first things that we want people to understand is lusting isn't something that we're always going to be doing. And I would also say that lusting has an additional energy. Lust is a verb. That I'm wanting to possess something. I'm wanting to take something. I'm wanting to get something because I believe that thing will do something for me. And what I would say is, in addiction, we're not lusting after a person, we're lusting after our drug that is represented as a person.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to be back with you today, and we have the pleasure of not only having our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. How are you doing, Greg?
I am doing well.
Well, and we were able to influence and convince and beg our own staff therapist, Rebecca Dekkers, to join us again today. How are you? It was a hard push. It's costing us a lot of extra, resources, but we're happy to have you with us.
Yeah.
So tell us today what we're going to be talking about.
Well, I still had some questions that I wanted to honor from my group members that they had for Dr. Greg Miller here. So I put some together, and this one is another one that sort of is an amalgamation of different people's voices, and it's a little bit of a longer one, so maybe I'll read it. But it's another great question, and one that can come up often. And so her question, or the bunch of these group members' questions was, what is an appropriate way for a man to interact with a woman, both early in recovery and later? This gal said versus bounce their eyes or go entirely off the grid, which I know isn't fair, even though I kind of want it, which I thought was fun. How do men make that transition from, I guess, objectifying the women around them or seeking relationships with them to being able to be in an appropriate relationship with them, where they can see them as a whole person and it doesn't threaten what we have? What's reasonable for me to expect?
Yeah. And I just want to validate that is a complicated
question. There you go.
Especially that reasonable. What's true is there are some core beliefs that we can start with that help inform the answer to that question. And I would say that the first one is lust is not inevitable. That lust isn't something that is guaranteed. And so if I start with the belief that I will always lust, well, more than likely then I will always lust. So one of the first things that we want people to understand is lusting isn't something that we're always going to be doing. And I would also say that lusting has an additional energy. Lust is a verb. That I'm wanting to possess something. I'm wanting to take something. I'm wanting to get something because I believe that thing will do something for me. And what I would say is, in addiction, we're not lusting after a person, we're lusting after our drug that is represented as a person. And even separating that out, where I often talk to men about the fact that if they're seeing a person that they're lusting after, the question is always, what do I want to be rescued from and what do I want to be rescued to? I don't see this as a person, I see myself as this drug addict wanting my drug in this case. So then the logical question is, what do I want my drug to do for me? When I'm working with a man early on in their recovery, I often say, I regularly encourage you to ask yourself, on a scale from 1 to 5, how much do I want my drug? 1 is I don't want it much at all, 5 is I'm jonesing for it. Then the next question is, and if I were to take my drug, what do I want my drug to do for me? And that way I begin to have an internal conversation with acknowledging I have some need that I want met by this. There's something going on. Maybe I want to be rescued from my anxiety, or maybe I want to be rescued from my insecurities or my loneliness, because something's getting triggered in me. And over the years, through maybe exposure to pornography or early experiences with somebody else, I begin to believe that somebody else is going to rescue me. And so even understanding, okay, if I am craving, if I am lusting, if I'm taking those second and third looks, there is something that's driving me that I need to understand.
I wonder if for some wives already there's a couple of things that will feel helpful. One is just that naming that lust isn't inevitable. I think for a lot of women, as we're entering this kind of, all the questions that come with this new realization, there is this sense like, oh, maybe this is everywhere. Maybe I just have to live with this. Maybe this is something that, I don't know, that I was thinking wrong about, or that all meant maybe I just have to get over it. But I'm wondering if there would not be a lot of relief already that lust isn't inevitable.
Right.
This doesn't have to be a part of how my husband relates to women.
Well, and what I would also say is there's, for a lot of men out there, they believe this because they've never really had experiences without it. You know, if this has been from the very beginning, my first exposure to something sexual, reinforced when I went through puberty, then I have this core belief that this is who I am, I can't change. And so I think for a lot of men, the idea that you do not have to live held hostage by lust is really significant. When I'm talking to men about triggers, I want them to understand that there's a difference between noticing and consuming. And we've talked about this, I think, on the podcast before. But noticing is just part of who God created us to be. God gave us senses. So we notice smells, we notice things we see, we notice things that we hear. And in fact, it's actually a protective thing. You know, if I'm walking through a dangerous place, then my senses need to be on high alert. I need to be noticing what's going on around me. If I feel threatened. And one of the things that can happen is for children who are unsafe growing up, they develop a hypervigilance, constantly scanning to see where safety is. So to be aware, to notice, is a healthy part of who we are. The transition, though, is when it goes from noticing to consuming. Consuming is when I take something, I take an image, I take a video, I take some sort of aspect of that experience, whether it's a person or something else, I retrieve it and I file it away, knowing that I can resource it later for some sort of escape. I can remember somebody that I saw on the street, or I can remember an experience that I had. Well, I'm wanting to file that away so that if I start to feel anxious or lonely or insecure, whatever my triggers are, I can retrieve that and I immediately feel some sort of sense of comfort. You know, remember on the last podcast I talked about the fact that addiction is when we're trying to avoid mourning and still be comforted. You know, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Well, if I'm lusting, if I'm pursuing, if I'm focusing or hyper-focusing on somebody, then I gotta ask my question, what am I wanting to avoid? What do I want to be rescued from? And you know, in our last podcast, we talked about so many of the men who struggle with addiction who come through our workshop, they are not associated or connected to their emotions. So they may be feeling anxious, but they're not connected to their anxiety. They may be feeling insecure, but they're not connected to their insecurity. So this thing kicks in before they're even aware of it.
It solves it quick.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's that momentary experience where I'm not even aware that I'm feeling anxious. I'm out in a public space, I see somebody, I go to an old pattern of temporarily getting rescued from my anxiety, and it works temporarily, and so I keep doing it over and over again.
Well, and I'm wondering too if for wives then that just that there's a structure and a process to it would feel helpful too for them to know, because there is that like just naming this is complicated. And that for the husband to be able to say, I've got a plan, a structure, a process, I'm going to ask myself these questions. I'm engaged in the process of wondering about this. Instead of sort of like going on autopilot, like you said, I'm not connected with the feeling, but bam, I'm already solving it somehow. Right. Yeah.
Well, and talking about a process, when we teach about triggers at the workshop, there are 3 things that I believe are helpful. And so if I'm triggered, the first thing I'm going to do is own it. I'm going to own the fact that I am triggered, and I'm going to name it to myself. Yeah. And the reason is very much like you said, if I can name that I'm triggered, then I can begin to ask those questions. What's going on for me? What's happening? The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to communicate it. You know, we have this old belief that when I'm alone, I'm safe. But the reality is when I'm alone, I'm vulnerable. I'm most safe when I'm in safe community. And so if I'm out in public, something triggers me, I'm going to reach out to my guys and say, hey, I've just been triggered, I'm aware of this is what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to do is own it. The second thing the first thing I'm going to do is name it, I'm going to own it. The second thing I'm going to do is communicate it, and then the third thing I'm going to do is release it. And the process of releasing it is figuring out what is this trigger trying to tell me about me. I often tell people, if I've had a conversation about a trigger, and at the end of the conversation, the person knows more about the trigger than they know about me, that's not a helpful trigger conversation. So yes, I may acknowledge I saw this person or I had this interaction, I know I got activated, I got triggered into lust or craving or whatever language I might use, and I got to figure out what's going on for me. And so I ask, what's going on for me? Well, I'm feeling anxious. Why am I feeling anxious? Oh, I've got this meeting with my boss this afternoon that I'm not ready for. Oh, that makes sense, I'm anxious, and now I want this hit of my drug to temporarily rescue me from my anxiety. And like what we talked about is, it happens so quickly that we're in it before we're aware, and so that deconstruction piece is really significant. But it can be done even in the very beginning. You know, one of your questions was, you know, in the early days, what can I expect? Well, I think even in the early days, we can expect people to begin to approach these triggers in a new way. It may take me a while to even know that I was triggered, you know, that automatic pilot, but once I become aware of that, then I can begin to respond differently.
And I think that is the scary spot for wives, is there is that sense like this just comes out of nowhere and it feels uncontrollable. But having a real sense that my husband has a process for it and he's owning it, then maybe I'm not feeling like, which, you know, as wives, I've had many joke about how there's that sense like, could we just go off the grid, never leave our house? Or sometimes even more seriously, I have had wives who have placed a lot of restrictions on their husbands and want him to not go here, not go there, anywhere where there might be a sense of like that this could be possible.
Right.
And that can be kind of a heartbreaking scenario for both partners.
Absolutely.
One for her, that she feels like this is necessary, and there's lots to talk about in that. But even for him, that there's, I don't know, just all the hopelessness that can come with that. Yeah.
Well, and there's a difference between engaging a trigger and indulging a trigger. And what we're talking about here, engage the trigger. But I'm not going to focus on the trigger. I'm going to focus on myself to understand what's going on with me. You know, I'll have a conversation with a man. He's in a restaurant. He wants to get the attention of someone. And his whole thinking, maybe consciously or unconsciously, is I just need to get this person to smile at me.
Yeah.
Okay? Well, what do I get from that smile? What do I believe if I can get that person to smile at me? What's the meaning and message I associate out of that? You know, I often talk about waiters and waitresses because I worked as a waiter in seminary. And the goal of the waiter or waitress is they are just going to serve you. All they want is the tip. That's their job. They want to make sure. So yeah, they're going to be friendly. But the reality is they want to get their job done. So maybe, yes, they smile. But the significance is, what is the meaning and message I make out of that smile?
Yeah.
What am I hoping to get out of it? That's trying to tell me something about my situation. And what's true is, in the early days, we're not very self-aware.
Right.
And again, that's the power of community, where they can engage us in a new conversation of what is going on for you. Why would you want the attention or the interest of that person? What do you get from that smile?
So even just making it really simple and practical, then what is reasonable for the wife to expect?
I would say it's reasonable for her to know what the husband's plan and strategy is. That he is operating from the awareness that this lusting part of him, this consuming part of him, is not inevitable, that he can live free from that. And one of the definitions that we have for trigger, a trigger is something that knocks us out of our truth. And so the goal when I get triggered is to get back into my truth as quickly as possible. And part of that is what's true about me, what's true about God, what's true about the situation, because that is the truth that's going to set me free. What's also true is, for a lot of men, they may become aware of the fact that they've been triggered, and that trigger, especially as they're engaging recovery, may actually lead them to shame. But again, their shame isn't helpful, because their shame sends them into isolation, which actually gives the trigger more power. And so I would say it's reasonable for a man to have a plan.
Yeah.
It's reasonable for a man to have community that he
Yeah.
reaches out to. It's also reasonable for a wife at the end of the day to have the husband be able to check in, maybe not about the trigger,
Right.
but about the fact, man, I realized how much anxiety I had today about that meeting I had with my boss. Or I got triggered into some old fear and insecurity by this conversation that I had with a coworker. Or we were out in public and I just felt old, and I'm starting to realize what aging is doing to me and how I perceive myself. But those are the kind of conversations, again, that are actually going to create intimacy and connection. I know that a lot of injury has been done in relationships where a husband, maybe even at the wife's request, has over-described the
Yeah.
trigger and now knows exactly what kind of person he is drawn towards. But the reality is even that has meaning. You know, the type of person I'm drawn towards tells me something about me.
Yeah.
A lot of times a guy will say, well, I'm just drawn to an attractive person. And what I want him to understand is that attractiveness has actually been defined for him by culture. You know, if we look at the reality of beauty, what was perceived as beautiful 200 or 250 years ago is very different than what we perceive as beautiful now, because our culture is defining beauty for us. And so we have to recognize, am I willing to engage the definition of beauty that my culture gives me? Well, if I am, why? Am I getting status from that? Am I getting value from that? But the reality is, when I recognize that this person that I'm in relationship with, this person that I can have connection with and intimacy with, that is the person that is beautiful, because beauty is about who she is, not just emotionally, but physically, the way that God created her. You know, if we believe that all of God's creation has beauty, then we begin with that in our relationships also. And it also makes sense, and that is true, that for a lot of women, their husband's actions have reinforced their insecurities. And one of the most helpful things that a man can do is to own that. That I am sorry that because of my insecurities, because of my addiction, because of my shame, I've created insecurities in you, and I want to do everything I can to change the narrative that you have by living differently now.
Yeah, I think that would be a really helpful approach a lot of times. We talk about this a fair amount in our groups too, that a lot of the wives feel a great deal of pain because whoever may be what the husband, if we've gotten into a pattern of really investigating between the two of us, which is, like we said, not terribly helpful, what the trigger was, who are the people you are attracted to. Often as wives, sometimes they'll get really caught up in watching his eyes and where he's looking and noticing who he's noticing. But in particular, a lot of wives can feel a great deal of pain around not being who his, what they'll say is his type. And I always tell wives that that it is important information for him to be able to identify what he feels drawn to. Not important necessarily for us to know that, because it's very difficult to depersonalize it, but that often what hurts us, we're trying to investigate or interrogate his survivor man.
Right.
And that's not necessarily who, like, it not shouldn't hurt us, but when we can understand, I'm not necessarily wanting to be who his survivors want.
Right.
That's not the goal.
Right.
I would like to be who his wise adult wants to be with,
Right.
and can show up with and be connected to.
Well, and I think the other piece you talked about depersonalizing it is recognizing everything has meaning. You know, so I'll have a conversation with a man and try to identify what are those places of trigger. And for some of them, there may be a particular age. They're drawn to this particular age. Well, age is important in understanding what's going on with the guy.
Yeah.
And for a lot of the guys, the reality is when they were that age, there was something painful that happened. Maybe there was a rejection. Maybe there was an insecurity. Maybe there was a great tragedy. And so now they go back within themselves to that younger age, and they're wanting that 20-year-old or that 25-year-old version of them to be rescued by someone that represents that age externally. And so even the idea of age, I know that for a lot of women, they have hurt and pain because it seems like their husband's always interested in somebody younger and they can't turn back the time. But even to understand, no, as a wise adult, I'm attracted to the person you are today. what your age is, what my age is. And the reality is, if a man isn't comfortable with his own age, he's going to be drawn to somebody else who has a different age. But that's on him, that's not on the wife. And so even to understand the age I find myself drawn to, the look that I find myself drawn to, the body type I find myself drawn to, all has meaning. And for the husband to be committed to get in there and figure it out versus just dismiss it and go, well, that's just my type. And what's true is there's a lot of men that aren't willing to do this deeper work to get in there because they don't start with the belief that lust isn't inevitable.
Right.
But as soon as they can begin, oh, I don't have to live like this, I can be free, then they become curious. And I often say part of the work of the journey of recovery is going from shame to curiosity. Be curious about why you get triggered by what you get triggered by. The answer will always be found in your story.
And so, any other words, I guess, for wives who feel like, because there's some of those different tactics, like and I know, and really that's a lot of my work with the wives, is how do we manage ourselves when I know my husband's off to work or is engaging in relationships with women. How do I manage myself?
Right.
But any other thoughts or advice about what they can reasonably expect, so that he's in community, that he's owning it and building his awareness around it?
Right. Yeah. I do think that one of the things that is helpful, and this is more directed towards the men, is if you are out in public and you find yourself just staring at somebody and your wife sees you doing that, and she makes a comment about that, you were staring at that person, instead of dismissing it, to be able to own it and say, you know what, I was staring at that person. And what may be true is, maybe I was getting a hit from my drug from that person, but what also can be true is maybe that person reminded me of someone and I was trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
Maybe there was something unique about that person that I found myself drawn to. So it works both ways. So when the wife has confidence the husband will own his behavior and actions, then when he is giving an alternative understanding, that she can trust that. But if he is always dismissing, no, I wasn't staring at that person, then it makes sense that she struggled trusting. And so it's that guy, as he becomes more self-aware of how he's operating, what he's doing, on a very different place. I struggle with some level of attention deficit chaos. I don't even know the word, but I'm overstimulated easily. And so if Beth and I are in a restaurant and there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of TVs, there's a lot of activities, I can easily be distracted. And Beth may say, Greg, you seem distracted. And ironically, Beth knows this about me, I know this about me, but many times my first reaction is, hey, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
There's this old pattern of defensiveness.
Yeah.
And to be able to say, I am, it's really loud in here, or there's the TV on and I can see it, but if I can be more present with myself, then I can own what really is going on for me. And that helps that wife be included in the internal things, because yes, she can observe stuff, but she won't know what's going on internally unless he's willing to be honest about that.
It's kind of that couple skill of checking perceptions. My perception is, and I'm speaking from my ownership place, this is how it seems to me. Is that true for you?
Right.
And it is a skill early on for couples, because there may be a lack of awareness, but there may also be a hyperfixation and a lot of meaning making. And so it is a bit of a skill to get that on board, where I can say, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. I'm experiencing you as staring at this woman. Is that true for you? It takes a skill to get that on board. Yeah.
Well, and I also think that piece, for me, the understanding of addiction is any time we're trying to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern. Recovery is identifying the legitimate need and meeting it legitimately. What men will discover is if they identify what their legitimate needs are and begin to meet those needs in legitimate ways, then they begin to experience freedom from these things. When they begin to interrogate and be curious about why they get triggered about certain things. When they have safe community to be able to share that with. And I do think that's part of the strategy, that a wife understands that the husband does have a safe community of men that he can process things with, and then as he's discovering, it's kind of like a commitment. The commitment is, I will process things with my community, and I will bring what I'm
Yeah.
learning about myself to
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And maybe I do need to have a conversation about my anxiety. Maybe I do need to have a conversation about some insecurities. And maybe I do need to have a conversation about the grief I feel as I'm aging. That really is a major theme of the men that I work with. And one of the things their addiction has been trying to do is to rescue them from their insecurities about their aging. So for people to be able to have a conversation about that. But the more we're talking about it and the more we understand what's going on, then the less vigilant we have to be
Right.
about it.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. I think that's going to be helpful to the ladies.
It's nice to know I'm not the only guy that's worried about how old I get. I feel it on a constant basis. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us again today. It's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast with us. And Greg, as always, beautiful leadership. We'd like to thank our listeners and our viewers for joining us today. We continue to be really pleased and impressed by the number of you that are listing this podcast as the reason why you are reaching out to us, either for our services or to register for one of our intensive 3-day workshops. We have created a nonprofit organization called the Laaser Legacy Foundation, and that's specifically to give you a vehicle that is a tax-deductible way of donating financial resources to help others reach out and get either the intensive workshop experience or the services that we offer here at Faithful and True. We thank you for that. We will put a link on the description of today's podcast so that you have an easy way of connecting with the Laaser Legacy Foundation. In the meantime, we hope that this coming week is going to be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.